Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Look, if you're diving into the history of Kentucky, it is so incredibly tempting to just look at the past as this basic timeline of names, dates, and election results, right? But today, we're going to elevate our perspective. We're doing a higher level analysis of how systems of power have fundamentally shaped Kentucky's history. Specifically, we're looking at the deeply entangled relationship between political machinery and public education. So let's just dive right into This Explainer and unpack the structural forces that built, broke, and ultimately forced the modernization of the Commonwealth.
Hooking right into our core theme here, I want you to keep this analytical question in the back of your mind throughout our entire journey today. Ready? What happens when political ambition collides with public welfare? It's a huge question. For over a century in Kentucky, the sheer drive for political dominance directly competed with the need to actually educate the state's citizens. It was this massive structural conflict where the kids sitting in the classrooms were the ones who literally paid the price for the political battles being fought in the State House. To really grasp how we got to modern educational reform, we first have to understand the historical systems that held it back for so long.
And the absolute foundation of that struggle was something called the trustee system. So, following the Civil War, Kentucky prioritized local control to an extreme, almost unbelievable degree. Just to put this into perspective, by 1907, there were roughly 8,500 districts governed by 25,000 trustees. And get this, a fifth of those trustees couldn't even read or write. What sounded like a great idea for grassroots democracy completely devolved into a massive patronage machine. Teachers literally had to pay for their jobs, and even school custodians became these critical voting blocks. Actual student learning? Well, that was simply not the chief goal.
This trustee system absolutely guaranteed massive structural inequality because schools relied almost entirely on hyper-local property taxes. Your geography dictated your destiny. Notice this stark comparison. In 1921, Louisville had 20 times the taxable wealth per teacher than the poorest Appalachian counties. 20 times. A poverty-ridden rural district fundamentally could not raise the funds of an urban center no matter how much they taxed themselves. This systemic inequality meant that true bottom-up reform was practically impossible. It desperately required state-level intervention that the politicians at the time were basically ignoring.
To ground all these financial realities in the actual human experience, consider Governor Preston Leslie's visceral quote from 1874. He actually called the typical rural schoolhouse a pen for prisoners, built at the smallest possible outlay. These were often just these little, square, unhewed log buildings. They were blazing hot in the sun or absolutely freezing in the winter, with the wind just whipping right through the floorboards. Students sat on slabs of wood with legs too long for their feet to even touch the floor. And crazy enough, by the 1940s, 65% of Kentucky's nearly 6,000 schools were still one-room, one-teacher operations. That was the physical reality born out of a totally broken financial and political system.
Adding tremendous weight to this already deeply strained system was the legally mandated racial segregation of schools. Back in 1866, the state passed a law mandating an entirely separate educational system for Black and white students. For almost a century, Kentucky chose to fund a highly costly dual system. We're talking 2 sets of schools, administrators, and supplies, which stretched their already scarce resources incredibly thin. Furthermore, early laws actually mandated that taxes collected from Black citizens could only be used for Black schools, virtually starving them of funding. And this was despite the fact that Black educators often possessed higher levels of college education than their white counterparts and showed immense dedication. This separate and unequal system perpetuated deep institutional inequality across multiple generations.
Section 1. Factions, Patronage, and Power. Let's move into the political arena.
Now, you might be wondering, if the education system was so demonstrably broken, why didn't the state government just fix it? Well, for the middle of the 20th century, Kentucky was essentially a 3-faction state disguised as a 2-party system. The Democratic Party totally dominated the governorship, but they were split in this bitter internal war. On one side, you had Earl Clements. He was a master organizer, highly secretive, cautious, and just brilliantly tactical. On the other side was A.B. Happy Chandler, totally personality-driven, populist, fiercely anti-tax, and an incredible stump speaker. The fight for dominance between these specific factions consumed all the political oxygen in the room. Patronage and political survival always trumped progressive policy. So instead of overhauling education, governors traded favors, they built turnpikes to reward loyal regions, and treated state jobs like political currency. Meaningful tax reform for schools? That was basically considered political suicide.
If you want a character study that perfectly encapsulates both the brilliance and the glaring moral blind spots of Kentucky's mid-century political machinery, look no further than Ed Pritchard. Known as the philosopher, Pritchard was an intellectual giant. He was a former law clerk to a Supreme Court justice and a White House insider before he even turned 30. But he had a massive, fatal flaw. In 1948, he was actually convicted of stuffing ballot boxes in a relatively meaningless election. He went to federal prison and suffered total political disgrace. Yet, in this wild Shakespearean twist, he quietly rebuilt his life. He became a behind-the-scenes advisor and eventually, in his later years, served as a highly respected primary architect of Kentucky's modern educational reform movement. His life literally mirrors the state's own journey, from corrupt machine politics to eventual structural reform. The data from this era reveals a massive, macro-level trend happening in the background. Take a look at the average year's experience column on this table. In 1970, a state legislator averaged just 3 years of experience. They were often part-timers, easily controlled by the governor's office, what people called a rubber stamp legislature. But watch that number climb. 8.8 years by 1990, 10.5 years in 2011, the legislature was professionalizing. Strong committee systems developed, and as these legislators became more experienced, they broke away from those old gubernatorial machines, power decentralized. This independence was absolutely crucial because a governor could no longer just dictate policy behind closed doors, they actually had to negotiate to pass systemic reforms. Moving on to Section 2, the rise of modernization. This rising legislative independence coincided with a massive cultural shift in how state politics were conducted. Enter the new politics. By the late 1970s and 80s, the old guard, the Clements and Chandler factions, had basically faded away. In their place came candidates like millionaire John Y. Brown Jr., who bypassed local party bosses entirely. He used his immense wealth to fund massive television campaigns. Suddenly, image and media savvy completely replaced traditional party organization. We saw the rise of shifting personal alliances rather than strict party loyalty. And, significantly, the state elected its first female governor, Martha Lane Collins, who actually made educational reform fashionable again, pushing through funding to reduce class sizes and raise teacher pay. But even with all these modernizations, that structural rot of the old, unequal property tax funding system we discussed earlier, it was still there. And that brings us to the real climax of our historical convergence. In 1989, the pressure cooker finally exploded. A coalition of property-poor school districts sued the state, arguing that the massive funding disparities violated the state constitution's guarantee of an efficient system of common schools. Well, the Kentucky Supreme Court didn't just agree, they dropped a historical bomb. They declared the entire public education system unconstitutional. Every law, every regulation, the whole funding mechanism, void. Boom. Decades of political can-kicking had finally hit a massive judicial wall. This judicial mandate totally forced the hand of Governor Wallace Wilkinson and that newly independent, highly experienced legislature we just talked about. They engaged in what Wilkinson called open political warfare, but they were legally forced to compromise. They passed a massive, highly politically risky increase in the sales tax, up to 6 cents on the dollar, and used it to fund the Kentucky Education Reform Act, or KERA, in 1990. Guys, this wasn't just a Band-Aid. It was a sweeping overhaul of curriculum, governance, and most importantly, it equalized funding across rich and poor districts. The historical threads of political infighting, taxation battles, and educational neglect were finally woven together into a modern, unified structural reform. So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought to take back to your class discussions. Consider the incredible arc we've covered here, from illiterate local trustees and one-room log cabins, all the way to hyper-partisan political machines, and finally to the modern, media-driven, independent statehouse that birthed KERA. The big question for you as historians is this: have we truly dismantled those deep historical systems of inequality, or did we simply build new, more sophisticated political machines to manage them? History is never just in the past. It is the framework of our present. Keep asking these hard questions, keep analyzing those structures of power, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.